Good afternoon, everybody. So as Jesse mentioned, I am part of the Cornell Maple program. If you guys are looking for any resources, feel free to reach out to me, and may have my email at the end, or I can give that to you at the end, or you can visit the cornellmaple.com website. We have some different notebooks that are out there. We'll refer to some of them as we go throughout today, but some different resources. So at Cornell, we actually have two maple research forests. I'm fortunate to be at the Eline Maple Research Forest in Lake Placid, New York, which is a more kind of northern cold climate forest. So talking today a little bit about what is a sugar bush, and so why do we need to focus on this? And so obviously we know it's not an actual bush, but this collective forest where we're getting all of our sap from. And we need to think that our forests that we are tapping and collecting all the sap for making maple syrup is the most important resource within your maple operation that you have. You can invest thousands of dollars into your sugar house and your boiling equipment, but if you don't have healthy woods, if you don't have productive trees, you're not going to have anything to be able to produce in. So why do we need to manage? We need to manage that not just to get that finished maple syrup at the end, but it is our factory. That is where all of those sugars are coming from. So think of it as, the starting point of your operation. And so you want to make sure that every points of your operation are in line, but especially that you have healthy operating forests. And so to back up into the little bit of the science of it, to think that and remember that it's all through photosynthesis that we're able to have these sugars that we're turning into a finished product, whether it's syrup or creams or candies. But through that photosynthetic process that's happening during the growing season of taking that sunlight and the water and carbon dioxide, producing those sugars that we use. So the easiest simple form to think of it in a non-scientific form is to just think of those leaves as being individual kind of solar panels that are turning sunlight into energy, and the energy in this case being the sugars that we're going to utilize. So also important to think about, not just what's happening in your woods during that sap flow season. It's important to be in your woods, even if sometimes if you have a tubing system, we like to think we don't have to go out there as much, but it is still important to be out there. But it's really important to spend time in your woods during the growing season, because remember, that is when those sugars are going to be produced. If you think about it, sort of like we're any agricultural crop, we're a little bit weird in that our harvest season isn't in the fall or end of summer. It's not going to be till the following kind of end of winter in that early springtime. So the harvest time's a little bit weird, but it really is, we're an agricultural crop. We have trees that need water, they need nutrients, and we need to take care of them throughout those growing seasons. So when you're kind of thinking about your sugar bush, it's good to have a plan, to think about what are your objectives, what do you want to have within your forest. So think of this not just as your sugar bush that you're tapping, but the overall forest land, that what can you utilize that for, besides maybe just tapping those trees. Do you want to use that for being able to cross-country ski through, to hunt in, to ride ATVs through, to bird watch? So thinking about what are all the objectives that you want to have within that forested area. Document the resources that you have. So what advantages are there within your forest, as far as the grades, the number of trees, then describing that property, what's the slope like, the drainage, and then what are some necessary actions that you need to take in order to maybe resolve some shortcomings within that, or to be able to have that as a manageable forest. So we'll talk about some of those components. And another piece that it's important to remember when it comes to thinking about our forests and our plants is that, remember that trees are living organisms, that trees, they're born, they live, they grow, but trees do eventually die. So it's not, it's not uncommon. We can't get upset if we do have trees dying here and there. If we're getting more dying than what should be, that's something to certainly be concerned about. But there are threats and things that happened within our forests. This picture on the left, that's after an ice storm, breaking canopies within the trees. That does unfortunately happen. And then, this picture on the right is actually after a little forest fire came to the area, and the far left-hand side of that picture was not burnt. It was kind of the edge of the fire, versus on the right, you can see where it was burnt. But as long as our forests are healthy, then they're going to be resilient. They're going to be able to bounce back from any of those individual threats that may happen. So that's kind of the key point, is to make sure we have these resilient forests, which are these forests that are able to respond to one or two threats. That is not going to totally wipe them out, but they can actually bounce back and be healthy living trees. And, along that same line is that, it's okay to cut sugar maples too, when it comes down to, if we need to thin trees, or if we have some that aren't doing well. We don't want 100% sugar maples. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But to get into this, a lot of the factors that, when we're thinking about our maple production, the two key factors is sap volume and sap sugar. Those are the two components that's going to influence our production. So volume a lot of times comes down to some of the different practices that you're doing based on your tubing, your kind of sanitation that you have with, changing out spouts or not, or using check valve spouts, or how old your tubing is, how well you tap your trees. And so that's a totally different topic that I'm happy to talk about sometime, but we won't get into that too much today. But if we look at the actual sap sweetness of the trees, and that a lot of factors for what is controlling sap sweetness, which is going to impact our ultimate yield, comes down to two different sections. Is looking either at the genetics of the trees that are there. And this is one aspect that we can't really control this unless we're doing some kind of plantation. And I do have a couple of plantations of genetically selected sweeter trees, but for the most part, all the trees that we're tapping are native stanza trees, so we're not going to be able to control this. But we do know that there are trees that are genetically sweeter than another if put into the same kind of situation, the same qualities and factors of the site. So then that second factor is the environmental factors, the site quality of where those trees are growing, what resources those trees have. And that's where those are the factors when it comes to sugarbush management. Those are factors that we can think about and look at. So what is site quality? Site quality is looking at these abiotic factors that are going to affect the productivity of those trees. And so one aspect is the climate. This one, unfortunately, we can't really control this too much unless you have some way you can create some giant bubble over your trees. But, the amount of rainwater that you're getting, the temperature, are all going to factor into that site quality. And then another big factor into site quality are the soils. What is the texture of those soils? So what is the makeup of the amount of sands and clay, silt within the soil, and organic matter that's within those soils, the drainage of those soils, and how much their water holding capacity or lack of water holding capacity. Are they boggy, kind of really saturated soils? And sugar maples, in particular red maples, will do better, but sugar maples don't like those heavy wet soils. So that's going to play a factor. Again, the water, kind of along the same line, the pH of the soil, which is going to affect nutrient availability. So we'll talk about each of these just a little bit. Soils really are important. One of my professors in college used to say that soils are the resource, and the trees that are growing on there are crops. So going back to thinking about agriculture, that a lot of farmers really control those soils, because they realize that that is that really important resource, and if we get good soils, we're going to get good crops out of that. And so the same can hold true within our forests as well. So what's the preferred soil that we want to have for sugar maples? Are usually relatively nutrient rich, higher in calcium, nitrogen, especially for sugar maples. We want some good water holding capacity so that there is water there. We don't want dry soils, unlike like oaks and pines can grow in a lot drier soils. Maples do not want dried out soils, but they also don't, as I said before, they don't want saturated soils where it's really, really wet. Red maples are more tolerable of a wider range of water within the soil, and even nutrients on a small standpoint too. So if you have heavier soils, you're more than likely probably going to see red maples growing in those type of regions. And we think about kind of the roots and those growing within our soils, that this is a kind of important factor to think about if you're working in your woods, especially if you're going to be using equipment, if you're using buckets, that you want to be careful that you're not destroying tree roots within the forest, because especially within a forest, most of your roots are going to be in the top, the fine roots, which are the ones that are bringing in all the water and nutrients. Trees are constantly growing new fine roots. The big thick roots, those are important for structure of the tree, and they're kind of conductive for bringing those water and nutrients into the tree. But it's really the fine roots out of the tip that are really only in the top 3 to 4 inches, maybe 6 inches, where most of those are. It's not saying that there aren't roots deeper down, but that's where a lot of the roots are that are actually bringing in the water nutrients, because that's where a lot of the organic matter is, which is where a lot of nutrients and a lot of water holding capacity within the soil. So if we're using equipment, if it's especially a muddy or kind of a soft time of the year, you want to be careful that you're not just driving all over your roots, creating all kinds of ruts within your forest, which are going to destroy roots. And those roots, in a rule of thumb, and this isn't true for every tree, but that roots will grow 2 feet in one direction for every inch of trunk diameter. So if you have a 10-inch tree, you're going to have roots going 20 feet in either direction around the base of that tree. So an old analogy, some people like to say that it was, if you look at the width of the canopy, you come out to the drip line, the width of the canopy there, and that's how far the roots grow. But a lot of times it's probably twice that amount. So keep that in mind. And those roots are spreading all throughout the forest. They're intermixing with each other. So protect your roots. Another important factor for tree health that we're learning more and more about is mycorrhizae, which is a beneficial fungi relationship with tree roots that attach to tree roots. They get carbon from the tree, but in return, they're helping to bring in nutrients and water to the plants and create a larger kind of network of even branching out more. So again, we don't want to destroy those. Having that healthy network is important within the trees. We're also finding that the trees can actually communicate, use it through mycorrhizae as well. All right, so going back to thinking about our soils and our soil health, thinking about the soil pH. So ideally for a sugar maple, we want a target pH range of about 5.5 to 6.8. But it's not uncommon to have a pH closer to, the lower 5 or even, high 4s. It's maybe not ideal for a sugar maple, but they can grow and thrive in those types of soils as well. It depends on where you are. In the Eline forest, I just had some soil samples done, and most of mine were lower 5.0, which I expected. I'm in the Adirondack Park, granite bedrock. The pH is naturally lower within this type of region as well. So, but higher the trees would thrive a lot more. I don't have the healthiest trees. I'm first to admit that. They could certainly do a lot better. So that's that target. And why pH is important, and if you don't any type of gardening, you're probably familiar with soil pH, but a lot of times we don't focus on why that really is important, and it actually has to do with the availability of nutrients. That if your pH is too high or too low, it locks up, and not to get into too much of the chemistry of soils and nutrients and soil fertility, but from the basic standpoint, just understanding that when those pH levels go too high or too low, nutrients are bound up within the soils and they're not made available for the plants. So they're held on to the soil particles and they're not freely available in the soil solution or the water soil solution for plants to be able to take up. So having that pH balance is important. If you have very low soil pH, you can add lime to try to increase that. That's the standard practice, which is full of calcium, which is going to benefit the sugar maples as well and help bring up that pH and allow other nutrients to potentially become more available. If you need to decrease pH, which is less common to actually have too high a pH in a forest soils, sulfur is the common method for that. So thinking about some of those nutrients as we kind of segue on from pH, first let's think about where do nutrients actually come from. And so the most important area where they're coming from is coming from the parent material, which is the bedrock underneath of those soils. That's where soils are formed as bedrock material weathers from either water or chemical aspects that weather down those soils and break it into soil, or weather down the bedrock into soils. That is where most of our nutrients our soils are forming from, and the nutrients that are made available within there. So that's kind of the bedrock, or the kind of starting place for our soils. And so depending on the type of bedrock you have is going to control the soils that you have. Organic material is a really important, so that's decomposition of any woody material, any fecal matter from animals, or leaves that are decomposing are releasing nutrients back into there. So a tree is a maple is taking up those nutrients, dropping its leaves and decomposing. There are some plants that have relationships with bacteria, such as black locust trees. Any of our legumes that can have the bacteria relationship has the advantage of taking atmospheric nitrogen and forming available nitrogen for the plant. And then the last one is kind of deposition or precipitation, with our nutrients that come in through rainwater, snow. So as I said before, bedrock being really important. I pulled this from online, the bedrock kind of geology map of the state of Michigan, where you can see the wide variation in the type of geology or bedrock material that is there, which is going to influence the soil types within those regions as well. Here's just an example of this. This is from some research plots that I've worked on in my graduate days up in New Hampshire, looking at two different types of soils, where we have the Bartlett experimental forest over here, which is in a granite bedrock, which is typically lower in nutrients, especially calcium. And here's a picture within those forests, which are still, healthy, nice looking forests. But you look at the understory, they're just not as abundantly rich in herbaceous materials, which prefer usually the heavier nutrient rich soils. Whereas the site on the western side of the White Mountains of New Hampshire, where we're in more of a metamorphic bedrock, which is higher in nutrients, higher available nutrients. And so real lush forest with lots of different herbaceous, and even the understory of woody plant species is doing a lot better growing within there, just because of available nutrients, and water has a higher water holding capacity within there as well. So that bedrock and kind of ground place of those soils and the available nutrients are going to be important. We mentioned the organic matter, so that kind of the decomposition. Here's just a quick look at what the percent of dry weight of a sugar maple leaf as that decomposes is releasing back into those soils that those plants will eventually take up, available calcium and nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. We see that sugar maples are high. They take up a lot of calcium, so the leaves and the wood are naturally high in calcium, and they require a lot of calcium as well. So when you think about nutrients, or even we can apply other resources here, whether it's water or sunlight. One kind of law that's often used as kind of rule of thumb is the law of the minimum, or Liebig's law of the minimum, when it comes to plant and plant growth. And so the easiest way to think of this is to think of a barrel here that's got different kind of broken staves. And what the law of the minimum says is that, I'm going to back up and actually say what kind of define that. The law of the minimum is saying that a plant is only able to grow, or something's only able to grow to the point where its most limiting resource is going to limit it. And so if you're lacking in that one resource, you're only going to grow to that certain volume, and then you can't, you're not going to be able to grow anymore. Another analogy is thinking of like a chain is only as good as its weakest link, and then it'll break. So if we think about it with this barrel, that you can only fill this barrel with water as high as you get the lowest broken kind of stave here, and that water is going to fill out. That's the minimum point. So that's our fill point, or growth point is wherever the highest point of the lowest stave. We can think of those broken staves as different resources for plants, whether it's water, sunlight, nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, you name it. You can have tons of phosphorus, you can have tons of magnesium or iron, sulfur, but if you're lacking in water, that plant's not going to grow anymore, or be any healthier until you're able to provide more water to that plant. And then it may be able to grow more or be healthier until it's limiting in its next resource, which in this case would be nitrogen, till it needs more nitrogen. So those are just kind of one aspect to kind of think about within plants, that you can have lots of one thing, but if you don't have enough of everything, the plant is potentially going to be limited. And one of the most limiting resources in our forest plants is not even on here, is actually the sunlight. And so when we're looking at what do plants need most of, it's oftentimes sunlight. Obviously not, a nutrient that we're going to apply, but there are, we'll talk about, management strategies we can do for that. And that's really important when it comes to regeneration, especially as younger plants need more sunlight in order to grow. So what are the limited nutrients if we actually not just look at all resources, but just nutrients, limited nutrients in your sugar bush? Most likely going to be nitrogen, potentially phosphorus, but most likely nitrogen and calcium. Nitrogen is really important for photosynthesis and overall growth and health of the leaves, but with photosynthesis, it's a key factor. And with that, as we already mentioned, photosynthesis is important for sugar production. So a project I did in grad school where I was actually looking at sap sweetness on forest or trees that were fertilized, and found that trees that had nitrogen, higher nitrogen, or where we added nitrogen, had naturally or increased their sap sweetness within the trees. Phosphorus is important for root growth, and we already know how important roots are. And then calcium, as we already mentioned, calcium is really important for sugar maples. Especially calcium is used for growth, for kind of stem growth, but also for leaf. It's a building block for cell and cell strength. So how do you know if you have a nutrient-rich sugar bush? So you can, we know we want these rich kind of mesic soils, but the best way is to do either a soil or foliage sample to see what you have available, or we can look at some indicator species. So if you want to do a foliage collection of your mature maple trees, you want to get leaves that way at the top of the canopy, your sun exposed leaves, because those are the ones that are doing the most photosynthesis, the most productive leaves. Unfortunately, that's tough to get samples of. One of the most efficient, fastest ways to do it actually is to shoot them down with a shotgun, to shoot a little branch. It does actually work, but it's not necessarily the easiest spot to do. So your best option is to take a soil sample and to look at what are the available soils within those regions that you have. I'm working on a project that we're starting at the Eline and the Arnott Forest as part of the Cornell Maple program, where we're doing some nutrient additions to look at, kind of create prescription plans. And we hope to have in a few years some nutrient prescription plans for those who are considering fertilizing a sugar bush. The fastest and the easiest way and the most cost-effective way to look at your soil health, though, and your available soils is you can look at a soils map that should be available within your region to get a rough idea. But walking out through your forest and looking for indicator species, indicator plants. And indicator plants are plants who grow on a very narrow tolerance range of soils and water level within there. And so if that plant is growing within that region, then that soil range that we want, that's ideal for sugar maples, should be available for them. So it kind of goes back to the picture I showed of the two different forest types in New Hampshire, where one, we didn't see a lot of, herbaceous plant materials, which are more kind of picky in the soils that they're growing in, versus the one that had all those nutrients available. So plants you can look for are the maidenhair fern, kind of low growing maidenhair ferns that you'll find potentially within your soils. That's a good indicator. Blue cohosh, I find some of this in my forest in a section where it is definitely higher in nutrients, but I don't find it too many other places besides that higher nutrient rich region of the forest. It's again a plant that gets maybe 18 inches tall. It's used for some people as a medicinal kind of herb. Dutchman's breeches, flowers in the early spring. The name comes from the little flowers that are formed there. Lower growing plant, doesn't get very tall. We're only talking like 6 inches or so on this plant. It's got this almost like geranium-like looking leaf. Another indicator of some nutrient-rich soils. Squirrel corn on the right-hand side is another one, much like the Dutchman's breeches. Slightly different in its flower shape, and its leaf shape is slightly different, but a low-growing plant again. The American ginseng is classic of a really good, healthy soils for a sugar maple forest. If we're looking for ginseng, Any ginseng hunters will start by looking in maple forests most often. Ginseng, much like maple, loves calcium. So if you have ginseng, you're pretty good chance that the soils are good, you're great soils for your maple trees. And another one to look for, wood nettle, which gets to be 2 or 3 feet tall. Will grow in a little bit more moist soils, but heavier nutrients as well. All right, so another factor, the things we need to think about is knowing the resources that you have within there. So it is important to go throughout your forest and kind of make this assessment of, we talked about that, looking at our soils, but looking at assessing the number of trees that you have per acre can be an indication of determining whether those trees are too heavily stocked, so being too many trees per acre, not allowing enough sunlight for those trees. Looking at, what's the age of those trees and how fast those trees are growing. You can have trees that are maybe only 8 to 10 inches in diameter, but they might be a 60-year-old tree. So either they're being suppressed more than likely by another tree, or something else is going wrong with them. And so again, looking at that tree size, your growth rates, your tap hole heal rate. So if you have been tapping your trees, hopefully you're looking back each year when you're going out to tap, or other times of the year when you're walking out in your woods, to actually look at your previous year's tap holes and see how fast those tap holes are closing up. If your tap holes are not closing within 2 to 3 years, then your tree is not healthy, more than likely. So it's a really good fast indicator as sugar makers that we have to look at, kind of indicator of growth rates and the health of those trees, is how quickly are those previous year's tap holes closing up. If you're getting full tap hole closure, or even 75% in 1 year, that's fantastic. Those trees are doing pretty good. If it's 50%, that's not too bad. If they're closed up within a couple of years, that's great. 3 years, that's okay. If it's taking more than 3 years to completely close up a tap hole, there's certainly something limited within that tree, and it could just be the tree, or it could be a site factor as well. But that should be an indicator of when you're tapping, whether it's worth continuing to tap that tree or not. If you've got a lot of open tap holes, those could be indicators that you've got something wrong. You may not want to keep tapping that tree. It could be a vacuum leak within your system as well. So I do encourage people, if you're not an organic producer, to mark your previous tap holes. So before you pull the spout at the end of the year, to use a little bit of tree marking paint and put a little dot below the hole, not in the hole, but just below it, and use a different color each year so that you can tell what year that tap hole was from, and so that you can look back and kind of monitor that from year to year. If you're an organic producer, you don't have the ability, unfortunately, to do that. And the last thing you need to look at, when you're walking out through your sugar bush, is looking at some threats to your forest, and we'll talk about those a little more. So when we think about kind of our stocking within our forest, within our maple tree, the old adage was that, if we're in a maple forest, we want maple trees, so cut everything else out that's not a maple, leave it maples. But now we know that it's better to have diversity of species within our forests. And so a rule of thumb that we recommend is about 75% maple trees, whether that's red maple or sugar maple. I should have had that on the slide here. And then 25% non-maples within our forest. So we don't want 100% monoculture maple forest. Mostly that's because if you get some kind of pest outbreak, if forest tent caterpillar, for example, comes into your woods and you've got cherry trees or birch trees, they're more likely to go for the cherry or the birch than they are your maple trees. So that's just one example of why it's important to have that diversity of species. But also, we as we learn more and more about soils and microorganisms and the mycorrhiza within our soils, we come to realize that that's really important for the health of the soils as well. And when you bring in other diversity of trees, you bring in other diversity of the kind of microfauna that lives within our soils and provides available nutrients and beneficial aspects to our soils. And so having that diversity of species of plants will bring in more of that and create healthier soils overall. So some threats that we need to think about within a sugar bush are looking at potential pests that are within our forest. So some common ones that some of you may be familiar with, the two on the left and the one in the middle, the one on the far left being the Asian longhorn beetle, the one in the middle being the pine sawyer beetle, which is not a threat. That's up here just as a comparison with the Asian longhorn beetle, just so that you don't confuse the two. But Asian longhorn beetle is one that we're always keeping an eye out for. It fortunately has not had too much of a spread, but we're always concerned and keep an eye that this will not spread with these big long antennae that curl down around it. The black spots versus the pine sawyer antennae are not quite as long, and it doesn't have the white spots on the black body. So that is one that could be very detrimental to our maple trees. So we're always keeping an eye out for that. One that you're probably very familiar in Michigan, that's spreading more throughout New York, but I believe you have a much more of an issue with it in Michigan, is the emerald ash borer, killing off all of our ash trees. Now that's not necessarily, you know, a huge threat to our maple, but with that, it's taking out diversity of species out of our forest, potentially creating creating open gaps that could bring in other invasive species of plants or something like that, but also creating danger within our forests. If you've got dead trees that could potentially fall on workers out in the sugar bush, but also onto your tubing lines as well. So one threat certainly to have. Another one that's new on the horizon that you may or may not have heard of is the spotted lanternfly. This is one that you may not have heard about as much in Michigan. It's actually right now in Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia area, and it's spread into New Jersey quite a bit. It hasn't established in New York yet, fortunately, but our folks in New York are within kind of our natural resources and within our forest operations are keeping an eye certainly on this. This is actually a true bug, which means that they're a sap feeding insect. They almost look like it's a type of like moth or butterfly when its wings are spread out. It's a very beautiful looking insect when it's adult in the top right, when it is spread out like that. And the top left is when it's an adult with its wings kind of folded back. And then the bottom two are in the nymphal stages when they're younger, which are still kind of neat looking insects, but they are pretty detrimental. They're heavy sap feeding. Their populations will explode. They are not something that necessarily kill a plant right off, but they pull a lot of sap. They're feeding from the sap from trees, and they excrete a lot of that sugars. They can't process all the sugars. They're mostly going to a lot of amino acids from the trees. And so they excrete a lot of sugars, and it leaves behind this sticky kind of mess dripping from the trees. So from what I've heard, if you walk under a tree where the spotted lanternfly is feeding in high abundance, it'll almost feel like it's raining. And then because there's all that sugar left behind, you get sooty mold that will grow on there and turns into this kind of black. And so it even becomes sort of a lifestyle impacts from what I've heard from, even talked to some people who are from those regions. So you can see that sooty mold on the leaf in this picture in the bottom right hand corner. And that is going to cut down on photosynthesis if it's on the leaf of the plant, but even getting onto like people's cars and decks and just not wanting to be outside within those regions where it's really become an issue. But we're really concerned among kind of vineyards and apple industry as well, that where it's going to potentially feed on the fruits and become have a big damage. But there is potential. We do know that they will feed on maples as well. Again, it's probably not going to kill them, but it could. It's one thing that could potentially limit the health of the tree, or you throw in a couple different factors, and the spotted lanternfly could be one of those. So one to keep an eye on. The spotted lanternfly is actually, its host plant is the ailanthus, which is also called the common name, the tree of heaven, which is actually an invasive plant in the East Coast. So it's not a plant that's even native around here. And so that's its preferred host plant, but we know that it will go to all these others, such as maples and grapes and other types of plants. One that we always kind of watch that it kind of goes in cyclical waves up and down is the gypsy moth, the heavy leaf defoliator. not as much of an issue in our maples, but it certainly can be. Usually attacks more of the oaks, but certainly can attack maples and have some pretty big outbreaks certain years that will completely defoliate. In the early part of the growing season, a lot of times the leaves will push out again, the trees will push out more leaves, but you really impact kind of that sugar reserve. And when it comes to tapping maple trees, if you have that heavy defoliation, it's oftentimes you don't want to pull more sugars from those trees within those certain years. Another one I don't think I have up here, it's pretty common, is the forest tent caterpillar. I shouldn't say it's that super common, but again, one that goes through common years, and that one does attack the maples pretty bad as a defoliator also. One that is a native that you probably have seen these scars in your forest is the sugar maple borer, where here's the adult on the left where it lays its eggs under the bark, and then the larva will bore under the bark and create these scars, these wounds. Doesn't usually kill the tree, but if you get a few of those on a tree, it can certainly limit the growth and the health of those trees. They're certainly good candidates if you're thinning a tree. Is ones you may want to remove. It's a weak point where that tree could easily snap because it's creating that large dead zone within that region. So they're ones if you can take out. If you're looking to take out a tree, it's a good candidate. Here's a really, really severe case of a sugar maple borer. They're usually not quite that bad, but other threats to think about or kind of keep an eye out for within a forest is freeze-thaw cycles that are heavy freeze-thaw cycles. Obviously, that's what we want for our maples, but what I'm talking about is when we get severe cold without snowpack. So snowpack is actually really helpful for our trees, that it insulates the soils. Roots are the most susceptible to freezing as a plant. If you look at, buds, stems, and roots, or flower buds versus vegetative buds, the flower buds are pretty susceptible, but roots are really, really susceptible to heavy freezing. And so snow helps to insulate that ground so that it doesn't get lots of freezing to those shallow roots that are closer to the soil. And so there's some indications that as we see in some areas where there's less snowpack happening year after year, and you're getting all that freeze-thaw cycles, that there's potential damage to roots and the overall long-term health of those trees. Other unfortunate things that we find are earthworms within our forest soils, and many people think that earthworms are actually a good thing to have within our forest soils, but it is actually a bad thing to have earthworms within your forest soils. And so within a garden, they are very beneficial. They do help to decompose organic matter, but we do not actually want to have earthworms in our forest soils. And why that is, and well, before I get into that, earthworms are not native. Any place that's been glaciated, earthworms are not native to those regions. So they've all been introduced to those. And why they're not helpful is if we look at this picture in the bottom right-hand corner where earthworms, hitting other things, where the earthworms were present, we can see that there's this thin layer on the very top where there's like leaves from last year that are laying on top, their whole entire leaves. But if you look down, it just turns into straight black, relatively organic, kind of rich soils. And then the layers are just all kind of mixed around. There's not distinct layers within those soils. And what happens is, because these leaves are being broken down too quickly by the earthworms, it's not helping to insulate the soils. There's not as much organic matter that's going to have as high a water holding capacity. So in the summertime, these soils can dry out a lot more. In the wintertime, if we don't have that snowpack, they can freeze and harm those fine roots. More also, the earthworms are decomposing those nutrients or decomposing the leaves, and that leaches the nutrients out of the soils faster than what usually a tree can often take it up. So it could be great right there, you get that quick flush, but if the tree's not taking all those nutrients up, it's being leached out through the soils and we're losing those. Where on the picture on the top hand right, we can see this slow kind of from whole entire leaves slowly down to partial, and then kind of can't even really tell it's leaves, and we go down through these different layers. This again is a nice soil profile where there's no earthworm activity, where we get this nice duff, this leaf litter on top, this good humus organic soil, and then we get down into mineral soil. So there's been some studies. There was one actually done, I believe, out of in Michigan, where they found that sites that had earthworm activity, the trees were about 30% less productive than sites that did not have earthworms. Other threats that aren't going to necessarily maybe impact our mature trees, but is going to impact the long-term and the overall health of the forest and the soils, but impact the long-term as far as regeneration is invasive species, invasive plants that are grown in the understory instead of having sugar maples coming back in. So such as the honeysuckle plants that can be a big issue in a lot of understories. Buckthorn is pretty common as well to see that's growing in your understory, especially younger forest. Multiflora rose, you may find this in a forest as well, especially edge of forest coming in. You can see how thick of a plant they are. Nothing else is going to grow into those areas. Oriental bittersweet, those will impact more mature trees as they are going to climbing vine going up the plant, wrapping around the tree. Not that it's going to girdle it, but it'll go out onto branches and cover up other leaves of the trees of our maples or what other trees we want to have growing there. And understory, some herbaceous, garlic mustard can really wipe out regeneration as well. One that is not invasive, but can really impact regeneration, can grow in thick mats, is our hay-scented fern. So all ones, we're gonna quickly jump through these so we don't run out of time, but they're all impacting regeneration. And we want to think within our forest, especially if you have an older woods, you want to make sure that you have some regeneration, some new growth of trees that you'll have within those areas. And another big impact to that regeneration is the impact of deer. That they can be cute, they can be fun to hunt, but they are one of the biggest threats to regeneration within our forests. That a deer can come in and eat hundreds of little tiny buds off the tops of seedlings in one single night, and you just clip off that one terminal bud off of a seedling, that oftentimes is going to prevent that tree from ever, or that seedling from ever becoming a mature tree. So overabundance of deer is one big threat. And so if you're having deer impact issues, and hunting oftentimes is not enough to take care of them fully, but you may need to do some small kind of fencing to keep deer out of small areas. That's one thing that we recommend to allow some regeneration within certain regions so that you can get pockets of regeneration over time, especially if you're doing maybe a small little thinning or clear cut, little patch cut, that you can fence that off to keep deer out within those areas. So of all these threats, I like to kind of wrap up that piece to think about, these threats alone aren't going to totally wipe out a tree or wipe out a sugar bush. Deer coming through, or forest scent caterpillars or gypsy moth one year aren't going to totally wipe out our forest completely. But when we look at the decline disease spiral that's here, which shows that it's all of these different factors that combine together that could ultimately lead to severe decline or death of plants. If you don't have the proper soils, you don't have good drainage, you don't have the right nutrients, your pH is off, the trees are stressed. Any tree that is stressed is less likely to be resilient, so it's not going to be able to respond if there's a forest scent caterpillar or gypsy moth outbreaks. It's not going to be as healthy and have that reserve of sugars to put out a new flush of leaves and continue to grow. And then if it gets hit with some kind of invasive species plants and there's no good regeneration, or you have the lanternfly come in and sucking sap from the trees as well, those are all factors that are continuing to contribute to the decline of that, where they're not going to be resilient. So one or two factors can be okay, but it's when you hit a plant with several different factors. So I know we're kind of running out of time here, but I'm just going to quickly wrap up with thinking that to have healthy trees as sugar makers, the ultimate thing is a healthy tree, we need to tap them correctly. So if you're over tapping your trees or not tapping your trees correctly, you're not going to have healthy trees. So that's where we really need to start ultimately, is to tap our trees correctly. So if we look at this tree right here, we can see all these old tap holes. Is this a healthy tree? As a sugar maker, you should be able to go and out in your woods and look at just those old tap holes, or just look at this picture and determine whether this tree is healthy or not. And as I said before, you know, it's looking at that tap hole closure. And if we see all of these tap holes like that are still almost perfectly round, that's telling me that this is not a healthy tree. Now we could also look up and determine that there's no canopy at the top of this tree. So that's another thing, you know, you need to be always looking up, you know, don't just be looking where you're tapping that tree, but always assessing around that tree, looking up the tree to see what's that growth like. Is it even worth tapping that tree? If you tap this tree again, obviously, even if it had a little bit of a canopy or had a canopy at all, but you kept tapping it, as I said before, this could become a vacuum leak. So when it's tapping, you shouldn't start tapping a tree till it's at least 8, but I even say 10 inches of more on a tree. But I don't like to always use these defined parameters of it needs to be 8 inches or needs to be 10 inches. What's really important is the amount of new growth that is going to form on that tree once you start tapping it, if you're going to tap it year after year. It's not like once it hits 10 inches, that's a magical point where you can start tapping that tree. You can tap a tree when it's 1 inch in diameter. You may not want to drill it 2 inches deep, but you can drill a tree, tap a tree that small with a small little spout. You will get sap. You're not going to get a lot, but it's what's the long term? Is there going to be new growth in the future as we continue to tap that tree? So as I said before, you can have a 10-inch tree that may be 60 or 80 years old or even more, that could be the same age as that 20-inch tree that's right next to it. If it's kind of suppressed or not growing, if you look at the canopy, it's kind of a flattened off canopy. That's probably not a tree that's going to be continuing to put on a lot of growth year after year. So look at the growth rates. How is that tree growing for the long term? Because if you start tapping a 6-8 inch tree and you tap it year after year, there's not going to be enough new growth in time to continue to tap it. You're going to start hitting old dead tap wood, which is going to decrease your productivity. 2 taps, I don't like doing it. I stay away from in my woods because, as I said before, my woods are not all the healthiest. I'm in a cold climate. The soils are not the greatest. My trees are not the healthiest. It's not worth it for me. They're not growing as fast. They are productive trees. They do great, even though they don't always look the healthiest. They do produce well, but I know the growth rate is not not that high because it's a shorter growing season. So I only do 1 tap in all of my trees. You do want to wait. Don't put a second tap into that tree is at least 20 inches or more. But again, it goes back to how fast is that tree growing before you put a second tap in. At the Cornell Maple program, we like to promote the tapping, pattern tapping, which is saying that, and the reason for doing this is it kind of helps get into new healthy sapwood each single year, so you're not hitting old stained column wood. It just gives you a system, and when we've started implementing this at both of our forests, we were more successful in not hitting old tapwood, old stained column wood. When you are tapping, you should always be looking at the shavings. You should get white, milky, creamy shavings, not dark brown, tan, or not dark brown, but even like tan shavings where you're hitting that old stained wood. So always be looking at your shavings, making sure you're getting a good, clean tap hole. And so when you do pattern tapping, you're less likely to hit that. But that's if your trees are growing fast enough as you continue this pattern around the trees. So we like to go at least 1 inch left or right of the old tap hole and up at least 8 inches up or down. And so if we can kind of see this, even though I think this goes back to that same tree that's now pretty much dead, but it gives us a nice example of, we see this up down pattern going around. So we shift over an inch. In this case, we're going to go up 8 to 10 inches or even more. The next year I would shift over another inch or inch and a half, 2 inches, and come down 8 to 10 inches on that and continue that pattern. So I'm slowly working around the tree. So by the time I get back to this side, that tree should have put on a couple inches of new growth. So I'm tapping into new wood from a distance before I even walk up to this tree, because I've got the tap holes painted. I know where I tapped in the previous year, and I have a rough idea where I'm going to tap, but I'm still also going to check. I'm going to look up at the tree and make sure that there's not any old tap holes that weren't marked on here. I would avoid a straight line across here. This maybe isn't the best example. I like to stagger them off a little bit more so it's not across, even though it's not year to year. But keeping those apart, you're less likely to get vacuum leaks. Drilling depth anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 inches. If it's a tree that's never been tapped before, go ahead, tap it 2.5 inches. If you know your trees don't grow that much, I would keep it to 1.5 inches. That's what I do at the Eline Forest. If your trees are pretty healthy, growing well, then 2 inches isn't too bad. But the key is the deeper you go. If they're old trees have been tapped for 50, 60 years, like they have been at the Eline Forest, you're more likely to hit older taphole wood underneath of that. If they've never been tapped, it doesn't really matter how deep it is per se, but research done shows that anywhere from, once you get up to 1.5 inches, from 1.5 inches to 2 inches or more, the gain in sap is really negligible. So it's not worth it to me to tap any deeper. So the key is to make sure that you're not getting into that decay column, such as we see in here, that there's insufficient diameter growth. We're hitting into that old stain column that's within the tree. That does taper as it goes up and down the tree. But remember, that taper of that stain column is oftentimes 8 to 10 inches or more above and below that tap hole. And it varies. Some trees, it may only be 6 inches. Sometimes it can be 3 feet. So there's a lot of variation. And so last piece is encourage good tree growth. Thinning, we highly recommend thinning. Do it before you set up any type of tubing system. Remember, 75% maple, 25% non-maples, and anywhere from about 70 to 100 trees. That's not necessarily all maples, but 70 to 100 trees per acre. It's going to depend on the age. And when we thin a sugar bush, it's a little bit different than a timber forest, in that a sugar bush, we want deeper canopies, deep and wide canopies, not stocked quite as high as a timber forest. Usually want smaller, shorter canopies, so it's less branchy and you get more saw logs out of it. As a sugar bush, we're less concerned about saw logs, but big canopy, higher factories, the little leaves are little factories for producing sugars. Roads are important. Make sure that you're not creating muddy roads. Keep them straight, keep them shallow so that you're not disturbing those roots. And then think of what are other aspects that you can do within your sugar bush. Can you be growing mushrooms? Is there firewood? Is there saw logs that you can also get? Ginseng, other understory plants that you can have. Are there other trees you can tap, such as birch trees or beech trees, which I've been doing at the Eline Forest. As far as tools, your state forestry agency should have tools to help you write a management plan, have lists of consulting foresters to work with, example contractors, reach out to private foresters, your local soil and water conservation districts, your state cooperative extensions, your local, a lot of times a local state environmental agency will have foresters who will work with you for free. And then we also have our Cornell Maple program. We're certainly happy to help you. And we have a Cornell Sugar Bush Management Notebook, which is on our cornellmaple.com webpage. So I will stop there and turn it over to questions.
All right, Adam, we had several come in while you were talking. So some of this is going to be repetitive, but Sandra asked, what species do you recommend as non-sugar maples? When you talk about that 25%, are all trees good as long as they're diverse?
Yeah, great question. One that we typically sugar makers don't recommend is to limit the conifers within a forest. Within a sugar bush, partially is they usually lower soil pH or more acidic. Another factor is they can shade your maple lines, and that can prevent them from thawing out as quickly. So that's one downside to conifer forests or conifer trees. So if we're pine trees, spruce, fir trees. Another big factor is that's conifer trees are usually where squirrels like to nest, and any sugar maker who's had tubing knows how awful squirrels can be in chewing your tubing system. So those are ones that we usually try to avoid if possible. If you're actually selecting, if in a perfect world, doesn't mean that they're not in any sugar bush. I have plenty of them within my forest. If we can remove them, that is one option. So it's going to depend on your soils the trees species that you have available. So if they're ash trees, cherry trees, birch trees, you may have basswood, Beech, potentially. Beech is a different story. I'm not sure if you guys have beech bark disease as much of an issue as it is more in the Northeast here.
Yeah, it's killing all our beech.
All right. Is it rapid, or is it newer thing, or has it been around for years?
It's been around for a while. I mean, and it's all of our trees are dying within a few years now.
Okay. Yeah, and the disadvantage of beech is that if you cut it too heavy, then you get the beech thickets that grow back from that, and that impacts regeneration. It's awful to work in. But having a beech in your forest is, an actual beech tree, if it's one, is not bad to have. So
Okay. So there was a lot of questions, and these came in as you were talking towards the end about taps per acre. But what about basal area? For those that have worked with a forester, is there a target basal area that we should be looking at?
I don't have a straight answer for that right now. It's
Okay.
going to depend on uh, the age of the forest overall too. I don't know if you have a better answer that you want to hit on that, Jesse, or
I think it all depends on what your ratio is. Unfortunately, the Sugarbush we inherited up here at this station is almost a monoculture, and our basal area is sitting in that like 110, 120. The problem I face there is the deer have wiped all regeneration for the last 3 to 4 decades. I don't even have beech sprouts. So,
Hmm,
um,
those are
I'm
hungry deer.
yeah, very hungry deer. So I'm worried about that. Stu Peterson out of Minnesota has asked a little bit about tapping below the lateral lines. It looks like some of your photos, you're blessed with some slope. Um, we we're I guess I would call myself a flatlander. Um, do you have any experience tapping below the lateral line using a vacuum system?
Yeah, we do that on time to time. It's not my first choice, but it's not my last choice, and I don't rule it out. So my predecessor, Mike Farrell, did some research at the Eline Forest. Abby Vanderberg and Tim Perkins at University of Vermont also did research on that at the same time, and they both found that tapping below the lateral line is just as productive as tapping above the lateral line. It doesn't actually impact production as long as you have high vacuum. So if your vacuum is 10 or 15 inches of mercury, then don't try to tap below the lateral. But if you know you're going to keep your vacuum up throughout the season, then tapping below the lateral is certainly an option that is viable. So on some of our trees, because as I mentioned, some of my trees just don't grow well, and I'm running out of room and spots to tap those trees, then we do go below the lateral, and they seem to be fine. So it's just the
So
big thing is keeping vacuum up.
yeah, to keep your lines basically clear, right?
Yeah,
So it doesn't
yeah, and
affect.
as you know, for in Michigan, when you're not blessed with the slope that we have, maybe up here and that Adirondacks, it certainly can be an option where you may need to do that a little bit more.
Okay. So we had a question from Western New York come in that they're seeing huge numbers of gypsy moth egg masses. Are we in trouble? And should we perhaps adjust the tapping then of the trees, or take a 2-tap to a 1-tap tree?
That's, I mean, not a bad idea for, it's hard to see, I guess. I have heard reports, and I got a call from a person just yesterday, north of me, even farther north of New York, that was seeing a lot of egg masses. So I'm a little concerned about what we'll have next year. For this coming year, I guess it's probably not a bad idea to, if you have a tree, to maybe only do 1 tap on that instead of 2, so that it has that more of a reserve of sugar. So in case there is a heavier defoliation within those woods this coming season, that those trees will able to rebound and push out new leaf growth after that. I guess time will see, or time will tell what we get from that. It's not always the cheapest, but there are potentials for BTI, aerial spray
Mhm.
forest.
So another question came in, and I'll be honest, this is the first time I've ever heard of anybody trying to tap a beech tree. I've heard birch. We've made birch syrup up here, but talk to us a little bit about beech and kind of walk us through it. And what does it taste like?
Yes.
And what's the yield like?
What's that?
And what is the yield like on a beech tree?
Yeah, so I started doing it the last 2 seasons on a pretty small scale. The yield is not the greatest, I'll be honest. What I am finding is you have to have vacuum. So last year I put out some taps on vacuum, and I had some the year before too, but last year I put out some on buckets, and I didn't get a single drop from those trees all year. So I think you have to have vacuum. That's what makes it actually, able to get sap from those. So you're more sucking it from the trees. Yield was not great this past year. That's one thing I need to answer a little bit more, because there's so much unknown, and I'm just kind of starting to scratch the surface just a little bit. Sugar wise, it's pretty low. Getting 1% sugar or less, even down into 0.5% range. So reverse osmosis would be strongly recommended for that. I've tapped trees from 2 inches in diameter up to 14 inches diameter, ones that are riddled with beech bark disease. They're all giving me sap. Obviously, the bigger trees are giving me more sap. This past year, unfortunately, was not a great year for it. We had a fantastic maple season, but the birch and beech season was not as productive. We had a really cold kind of, that springtime after the maple season. The weather just never really warmed up, which I think would have helped with production. From what I'm finding as far as sap flow, again, because I'm more just sucking the sap from the tree in a way, or not, through that negative pressure, that you want the soils to be really thawed out, so you have sap flowing within those trees. Warmer weather is better. It doesn't have to be really warm like it does with the birch, but the warmer I think is better for them. As far as flavor, I find it a lot better of a flavor. Well, I shouldn't say better, because I make birch syrup and I really like and appreciate birch syrup, but it has its own unique uses that most people, when they taste birch syrup, it's a little off-putting at first if you're thinking maple syrup. But the beech syrup is closer to maple. It's kind of an in-between. It's not off-putting. It actually has this kind of dried raisins, dried plums, dried pear kind of flavor. So similar to maple, but a little bit different, unique flavors. I think if you didn't know it was beech, you'd probably just think it was some kind of off-flavored maple syrup or odd maple syrup, but it is still very good syrup to make. So there's lots to know into there. If anybody's thinking about tapping them or wants to try it or does do it, certainly let me know. I'm always looking for, finding out what people are doing with it or what they're finding. Do we lose Jesse?
There we go. No, you did. I'm back.
All right.
Sorry about that. The perils of working in the Upper Peninsula where internet can some.
Are you there, Jesse?
Hello?
I can hear you right now.
All right. So is it at the same time as birch?
Yes and no. So I've been tapping my beech like halfway through the maple season. So most of the snow is gone. So the soils are a little warmer, and then I continue it all the way through into the end of birch season.
Okay.
So I think it's just that little bit warmer. I should try tapping some later on, just during birch, to see how then maybe they would just flow better at that point, so the tap pool's not drying up. It is I need to do some timing and tapping experiments with that.
Okay. What about a fella ask about black walnuts? Have you had any experience? I know of guys tapping it.
I haven't tapped any up here. We only have a couple really small ones that Mike Farrell planted when he worked here. I tapped some when I was teaching at SUNY Cobble skills of black walnuts and some butternuts. They were frustrating some days. So some days I got sap, and some days when I thought I'd get sap, I didn't get any, but it made really good syrup. It does have pectin in it, which actually I didn't mention. The beech I found also has pectin in it, so it just creates a filter issue a little bit. So I have tapped walnuts a little bit. I haven't really done research, and I haven't done it in a high volume. I'd love to do it more. We just don't, it's not a tree that grows within this region, and there's no big planted ones around either. So it is, I think, a great option for anybody if you have them, certainly to tap them. As far as detriment to the wood, it's not necessarily going to cause huge harm. That mostly you're going to be in the sapwood, and you're not getting into the darker heartwood, which is what most people would want from a lumber standpoint. Where I get most of the questions about that, folks asking, are people who are in like Kentucky or Ohio, West Virginia, that have higher abundance of black walnut trees. And Mike Recklin at down in West Virginia has been doing a little bit more walnut research, which is great because they do have those stands of them. So I'm glad to see that he is doing more of that. So he's finding some interesting things. And he tapped a walnut by accident last year later on, once the season he thought was over. So it was after the maple season, and actually found that it flowed better than what it did during the maple season. So he stumbled kind of upon that. That's still unknown whether that's actually a better time to do it or not. So we'll see.
Great. And a lot of these have already been answered. So